Okay, so as Mo said, I'm going to be talking about a competency framework for language learning materials writing. And this is something that I put together as part of a process. It was the end step in, or the final step in my NILE MA in professional development in language education. So for that MA, first I had my Cambridge Delta, so that contributed some points towards it. Then I did a module in trainer development and a module in materials development for language education. And after all of that, I had to put together a dissertation. And I wanted to bring together this idea of developing teachers and developing materials, and I put them together into competency framework. So the first thing I want to show you is, what is a competency framework? What do I mean by this? So some of you might already be familiar with competency frameworks for teachers. I think probably one of the most famous ones is this British Council CPD framework. So this has various different levels for teachers, various different areas like managing the lesson or understanding the learners. And each of these areas has various different points that a teacher should be familiar with or can develop their familiarity with to become a better teacher. So this is an example of a framework for teachers. Another one is the Cambridge English Teaching Framework. This one has stages that you can work through, like foundation, developing, proficient, expert. And another one is the European Profiling Grid. This one is a little bit similar to the CEFR in that there are 6 levels, 3 development phases, 1, 2, and 3, each broken down in point 1, point 2, point 1, point 2. And the idea with these competency frameworks then is, if you develop your skills in these areas, that you will become a better teacher. Okay, so there are quite a lot of these frameworks around for teachers. I think I found at least 9 or 10. Then if you're a teacher trainer, there are also, here's another one from English Australia. So sometimes local areas, local teaching associations will put together a framework. It doesn't have to be an international one like British Council or Cambridge. Again, this one has levels and it's broken down into different categories. So there are also these frameworks for teacher trainers or educators, not as many as for teachers, but they exist. So again, British Council has a CPD framework with areas like knowing the subject or managing teacher learning. Cambridge also has a framework. They have 3 different levels here, from teacher to trainer, autonomous trainer, and lead trainer. And as you can see, they have all these descriptors, what it is that you need to do at this level in this area. Okay. By the way, the link to the slides I'll share again at the end, or you can see it on the right-hand side if you want to go and investigate any of these frameworks for yourself. I do think they're all useful ways of thinking about your teaching and what areas to develop in. So there are frameworks for teachers, there are frameworks for trainers. There's also even one for academic managers. So there's the Equals Academic Management Competency Framework. So again, this breaks things down into 4 different levels, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is an excerpt from professional development, for example, developing professional development within your institution. But what I noticed from all of this is that competency frameworks for materials writers, this was hard to find. So what I was inspired by when I was putting together my dissertation was going to a talk at IATEFL Belfast in 2022. Denise Santos, who is an experienced materials writer, was presented a talk that was called CPD, Continuous Professional Development for Materials Writers, in search of a framework. And she was looking for some kind of framework to help her develop better as a materials writer. And in her research for her talk, she came up with this kind of simple triangle of a continuous process of planning some area to focus on, doing and monitoring that area that you're focusing on, and then evaluating it. But she didn't actually define any specific areas. She had ideas for things that might be there, like your knowledge, developing your knowledge of pedagogy or of technology or editorial knowledge. But there wasn't kind of a list of skills to develop like there were in any of the teaching or training frameworks that I've shown you already. And so I realized that this was a gap, and it was something that I was inspired by. I needed to have something that I wanted to work on for 18 months for my dissertation. And I thought, right, here we go. This is what I'm going to look at. So I decided that it was necessary, but then I thought, okay, I need to justify this. Why is it worthwhile? Why is it important to have a competency framework for language learning materials writing? So for teaching, it's obvious that teachers need some kind of framework to help them develop. There's so many aspects to teaching. When I was doing my research, when I was doing my background reading, I found some really interesting quotes that I think I kind of already knew. And I think when you see them, you'll think, oh yeah, that's true. But seeing it in the literature really made me think, yes, this is quite an important area to focus on. So the first one is a simple thing. All English language teachers need to create their own materials at some stage in their working lives. I don't know about you, but as a teacher, I was creating materials right from my initial teacher training course, even if that was a worksheet, if it was a presentation slide, you're creating things straight away. But also, I don't know about you, but I never got any training in that. Nobody said to me, here's how to lay out an effective worksheet, or here's the information that would be useful to include, or this is why your worksheet isn't working, or this exercise that you've put together a grammar exercise, here's why it's not effective for the learners, here's how you can upgrade it, how you can improve it. So we need to create these materials, but there's a gap in our training. We don't seem to be taught how to do it. Another reason why it's important to focus on the materials. The instructional materials that we use, whether that's a course book or materials created by the teachers, these are generally the basis for much of the language input that the learners receive. So most of the input that they get comes from the materials in some way. Those materials might be your PowerPoint presentation, they might be your book, but it's quite unusual that they're getting input from other areas, much as we might wish that they do. The instructional materials also are serving as the basis for the language practice that's happening in the classroom. So the practice activities that the learners do generally come from the materials. So if you're creating your own materials, but they're not working as well as they should, then maybe the learners aren't getting the quality language practice that they need. And then there's also the idea that published materials that we use develop our own teaching. I learned a lot about activity types, about how to approach teaching from the course books that I was using, and especially from the teachers' books, how the teachers' books were laid out. They influence the teachers and learners. They tell us what teaching styles are maybe considered to be right or better or worse. Even if that influence is subconscious. Also, the things that we see in the materials, the people that we see, the places that we see, the situations that we see, they influence teachers and learners. I don't have time to go into that in a big way, but there's a lot of information out there now about DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion. I think I've remembered the E correctly. So if this is something you're interested in, look up DEI, materials writing and English teaching. They support teacher development, they support language awareness. So I learned English as a first language. I did know some grammar because I was learning foreign languages as well, but a lot of my language awareness came from the materials that I was using. but they're also something that teachers and learners can become subservient to. We just kind of work through our materials by rote. We do the next exercise, the next exercise, the next exercise. We don't necessarily question the materials that we're using. We don't necessarily question the quality of them, because we assume that if it's been printed, if it's been published, it must be good materials. Well, so if we know what makes good materials and what makes good materials writers, then we can critique our materials more. We can choose more, or we can think more about the materials we want to use, how we want to develop them, whether there is that space to create our own materials, whether it's necessary to do that, or the materials that we're given are good enough, for example. And ultimately, the materials that we use influence learning, both directly through the teacher's use of them and the learner's use of them, and indirectly through the way that teachers learn about language and are influenced to teach by the materials that they use. So if materials are so important and materials writing can have such a big influence, both in our classrooms and in the published materials that we use, why are we relying on trial and error as the way that we develop good materials writers? Why is it that we're not training people, giving them support in developing their own materials right from the very beginning of their teaching career? So that's the kind of downside. Here's the good news. If you do want to develop your skills as a materials writer, you're actually now much better served than you may have been 30 years ago. There are teaching associations like MATSTA, the Materials Development Association, like MORSIG, the Materials Writing Special Interest Group from IATEFL. I'm on the committee there and I'm organising the events and webinars, so do come along to those. We're continually trying to develop people's skills. TESOL, the International Association, has a materials writers interest section. There are also other MORSIGs that exist. For example, TESOL has one. I'm sure there are others that I've missed out, but there are more of these associations appearing all the time. There are also courses. So I mentioned my NILE materials development course at the beginning. There's also a relatively new course from about a year ago by John Hughes and Kath Billsborough, which is just called Writing ELT Materials. And that's aimed at teachers. It's aimed at you writing materials for your classroom. There are also other MA courses that involve modules in materials writing, but I know that those can be more expensive. So if you have a bit of money to invest, or you've got some professional development credits that you can use in some way, I definitely recommend looking into these courses. If you don't have a lot of money, then the free webinars that are on offer from people like MORSIG, those can help you develop. The MORSIG blog can help you develop. But then if you have a tiny bit of money that you would like to invest, but not lots and lots of money, you know, £10, £20, $30, $40, then I would definitely recommend some of the books that are available now as well. So for example, ETpedia Materials Writing, that has 500 different activities, tips to help you develop better English language materials. And then ELT Teacher to Writer, they have a whole series of different books. The two books in the top left-hand corner, these two books, the How to Write Excellent ELT Materials, those are compendiums of 5 other titles, but you can buy any of the titles separately as well. They're available as ebooks, or as most of them are available as paper books as well. They're super useful, they're super practical. They're generally about 90 to 100 pages, and they're just full of tips. Like, it's not, there is a little bit of theory in there, but it's full of here's how to do it better. And I would really recommend that. I would really recommend using these sources. Okay, so that's the good news. There's a lot of provision. But then how do you know where to start? So I'm going to come back to the meat of the presentation then. I've given you all of these ideas for resources. So this is where my competency framework comes in. So I mentioned that I developed it for my dissertation. This is version 1.0. I would really appreciate feedback. Okay. The email address for feedback, that's included in the framework document itself. And I'll give you the link again at the end for the actual framework. Okay. But on the right-hand side, again, as I say, you have the link to all the slides, and that has the link to the framework as well. It's all available on my blog. So any feedback you can give me will be great. So when I'm creating the framework, I had to think about language learning materials writing. So first, what's my definition of materials that I used? So I decided that materials are electronic or paper-based resources. So it doesn't matter what format they're in, with a pedagogic purpose. So they're designed with teaching in mind. So designed to be used by teachers and learners to facilitate language learning. But they can be teacher written or published or learner created. It can be any of the three. It's not just published materials. Language learning materials can be made by teachers and they can be made by learners. Competency. So a competency is a characteristic that's required for effective performance in a job, which can be observed in the real world. That's really important. I have to be able to see that you can do this, or I have to be able to see that I can do this. That it's measured against some accepted standards, that we know what good looks like. And he was talking about success criteria. That's effectively what some of these are, a success criteria. And that it can be improved via training and development. I should be able to train somebody to get better at this thing. So for example, I haven't included creativity because I can't train somebody to be better at creativity. I can give them tools to help them, but I can't make them more creative. I can help them access the creativity. But so that's something that's not in the framework, for example. Creativity is mentioned, but not in that way. And then a competency framework, what I've put together, a collection of competencies that are required for effective performance in a job. And they can be used by those connected to that job to assess current abilities. So what can I already do? Identify gaps. What am I missing? And then plan future professional development. So what do I want to do next? So I'd like you to bear that in mind when you're looking at the framework in a minute. We'll get there eventually, I promise. So how did I put together the framework? How do I know it's a good framework? These are the steps that I went through. So I started off by interviewing a framework creator, interviewing somebody else. How do you put this together? I then analysed existing frameworks, including most of the ones that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. I put out a questionnaire. If you are one of the people who answered my questionnaire, thank you very much. I got 124 teachers and materials writers and trainers from all over the world to tell me what they thought good materials writing looked like. I then interviewed people in focus groups based on the questionnaire results to develop it further. I compared what came out of my questionnaire and my focus groups to the literature on materials writing, and then I created it and reorganized it and reorganized it and reorganized it. And this is the results. Okay. So my framework has 3 sections. Section 1 is all about your background knowledge. What knowledge is it useful to develop to be able to write better quality materials? To some extent, a lot of that is teaching knowledge, but some of it is specific to materials writing. Section 2 then is about actually creating the materials themselves. So what do you need to put together the materials? And then section 3 is about the professional skills that work around materials writing. So that in particular would be if you wanted to be a professional materials writer, but there are things in there that are relevant for teachers producing materials as well. So they're skills that you need that go beyond the actual materials themselves. So I'm going to look at each of these in turn and show you the sections that are in there. So background knowledge, I think, is threefold. It has 3 sections. So we need to develop our understanding of learners. of who they are, of what their needs are. We need to develop our understanding of language, language across different areas. I'll go into more depth with that one in just a moment. And we need to develop our understanding of methodology and theory. Okay, so our background knowledge about teaching itself. How does teaching work? And how does language learning work? So these are kind of big sections. You can see everything's numbered. So I had 1, 2, 3 before, and then within background knowledge, I have 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, so that you can find your way around, so you can make notes and refer to things easily. Each section is then subdivided. So for example, to take a simple one, understanding language is divided into A, understanding systems, which is grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation. I'll show you that in more depth in a moment. B is understanding skills, understanding listening. C is reading. D is speaking. E is writing. And then F is understanding how to combine those skills. So this is background knowledge at this point, your knowledge that will feed into your materials. Okay. And then each area, each of these lettered areas, is then broken down into the actual competencies themselves. So, for example, understanding systems has 5 competencies. So 1 is can understand areas of grammar relevant to the target learner. 2 is lexis. 3 is pronunciation relevant to receptive understanding, so their listening skills. And then 4 is productive pronunciation. So this is about their speaking skills. And then 5 is the phonemic script. Anything that's in grey is linked to a glossary, because I don't want to assume that everyone who reads it can understand all of these terms. So feedback on the terms that are in the glossary will be really useful. It's also, I don't expect that you know all of these things immediately. That's the whole point of a competency framework, is that it gives you ideas about how to keep developing. I would like that even a brand new teacher and a super experienced coursebook writer could look at the framework and find ideas about how to develop. I'll talk a bit more later on about how to use the framework yourself. Let's just have a look at the yeah. So that's section 1. That's about your background knowledge. So section 2, about creating your materials. This one has 7 sections. So we start off with meeting learners' needs. Then we think about activity design, sequencing materials. So what order do you put activities in? What order do you put worksheets in? What order do you put a series of worksheets or units into? 2.4 is about providing variety and balance, how to keep your materials varied, how to keep them balanced. So we've got making sure that, for example, if it's not in your learner's needs, it's not just overwhelmingly grammar, that we have a balance of different areas to focus on, for example. 2.5 is about assessment. That calls back nicely to Annie's session. 2.6 is about the layout of the materials, thinking about what they actually look like, how easy they are to navigate. And then 2.7 is teacher support. I started off by calling that teachers' books or teachers' notes, but I made it a bit more general, because I realized that teacher support could be in the form of videos, for example. How do you help teachers to use your materials? So in every section of the framework, or in the first 2 sections, sorry, I've started from the learners, because they're the most important thing. Everything that we do should be for the learners. So in the background knowledge, we start off with understanding the learners. In creating materials, we start off with how do we meet their needs? And hopefully you noticed when we were looking at the competencies for language, that it was understanding grammar relevant to your learners' needs. It's not just understanding grammar generally. What is it that your learners need? And do you understand that bit of grammar for those materials that you're creating? I've also in each section tried to go, in inverted commas, from the smallest thing to the biggest thing, or from the in your classroom thing to the published materials things. So regardless of who's creating the materials, we want to meet the learner's needs. We want to be able to design effective individual activities. You might start putting together activities into a sequence as you become a bit more experienced. You're not just creating a single activity, you might create a whole worksheet, for example. Then you might think about how to vary your activities, how to vary your teaching. And then hopefully you're ready to think about assessment. Now, you may decide that assessment needs to come much earlier, but I thought that not everybody is kind of ready with their teaching skills to be aware of how they're assessing. So that's why that one's a bit later. I've put layout after that. We all, I think a lot of us spend a lot of time thinking about what does it look like on the page? Is it pretty? But I've actually moved that later, demoted that, because that's not the most important thing. It is important, it's useful, especially if you have learners with special educational needs. Do they have space on the page? Do they have white space to think? And then the teacher support is last, because this is when you're starting to create materials maybe to be used with other teachers, or you're creating materials which you want to use again in 2 years' time. So you're making notes for yourself. So again, every one of these areas is broken up into competencies. For example, 2.4, providing variety and balance. One of the sections in there is about interaction. So I'll just give you a minute to read the kind of things, the kind of competencies I've put into interaction for variety and balance. So as you can see, I've started off with things like varying interaction patterns, which is something we might be doing in the classroom as well. We're hopefully doing in the classroom. And again, within each area, I've tried to start with perhaps the easier things to implement. Anything where you might need to check terminology, like group dynamics, that's included in the glossary. An important thing about the competency framework is at the moment, I haven't got anything that tells people how to do it. I'm focusing on what skills and knowledge you might need. And I'm hoping that people will take this framework into their teacher training, into their courses that they run, to start to develop the how. How do we do these things? The final area then is professional skills. So professional skills has 5 different categories. We've got writing skills, which we will look at in a bit more detail in a moment. We've got digital skills, so the technology side of things. We've got understanding how you work, professional relationships, and then working with publishers. So writing skills includes areas like are you following written conventions? Are you using full stops, capital letters, question marks, things like that? Are you following typical conventions for that genre? So if you're writing a grammar exercise compared to if you're writing a speaking exercise, for example, or if you're writing a worksheet compared to a whole unit, are you following the conventions that are typical? Or if you're not following them, do you know why you're not following them? Are you doing it in a principled way? Digital skills covers things like different kinds of technology that it might be useful to learn how to use. And that starts off with things like, do you understand the basics of using word processing software? Do you understand how to use Word or Google Docs or LibreOffice, whatever you're using, in an effective way? Also includes presentation software. Do you understand how to use presentation software to create your language learning materials? Obviously, it includes AI as well. Do you understand how to use AI when you're creating materials? It's also about keeping up to date. So are you keeping up with the technology that can help you with your materials writing? That also includes, I can't remember if it's in 3.1 or 3.2, but one of them also includes awareness of copyright as well. So do you understand how to acknowledge other people's work in there? 3.3, understanding how you work. This is things like, do you understand or do you know yourself the best times and places for you to create your materials? Do you start spending far too much time creating the materials because you don't have a focus when you're doing it? Understanding how you work also includes professional development. Do you understand what your strengths are as a materials writer? Do you understand which areas it would be useful for you to develop? All three of those, I think, are relevant for teachers, not just for materials writers. Professional relationships does have some relevance for teachers as well, but also for materials writers. So this is things like building up a network of people who can give you feedback on your materials. It's things like working with other teachers to improve your materials. Being aware of teaching associations like Morsig and Matster that I mentioned earlier on. And then 3.5, working with publishers. This one is for people who are professional materials writers. And that includes things like knowing whether to go to a publisher with your materials or to self-publish, negotiating contracts, working with deadlines, things like this. So overall, hopefully, section 1, section 2, section 3, I've covered everything you might need to know for materials writing, for language learning materials writing, regardless of whether you are a teacher or a trainer or a materials writer or a manager, anybody who's involved in producing materials. Let me show you an example from writing skills. So this one is about checking your work. So can you edit your own writing? Can you proofread your own writing? There's a difference here. So editing is connected to the content of it. Have you included the right information? Have you included correct information? Proofreading, then, that's about things like typos, punctuation, spellings, things like that. Have you checked that the language learning materials that you're using are factually accurate? So, for example, if you start talking about learning styles, these have been debunked. So if you give learners a survey to find out if they are a kinesthetic learner or a visual learner, this is not factually accurate. That's not a good thing to be including in your materials. Can you work with editors to improve your writing? An editor might be somebody professional and paid, but an editor might also be somebody else in your staff room. Can you exchange your materials with somebody else and get them to notice things that you could improve? Can you get feedback on your language learning materials, including from piloting? So, for example, you might pilot a lesson with one group of students and get feedback on it and then update it in B6 to improve it so that you can use it with another group of students. Feedback could also come from colleagues. It could come from your partner. It could come from your children if it's children's materials you're creating. If you give it to them, are they interested in it? Do they want to use it? All of this can help you to improve your materials. And this is just one element of the writing skills that I mentioned before. The next thing that I want to look at then is, if you're a teacher, how can you actually use this framework? So you can use it as a starting point for choosing areas for your professional development. So, for example, choose one area you're interested in. So that might be the writing skills that I looked at just now. It might be adding more variety to your materials. And then choose one competency to focus on. It's important to pick one thing at a time. If you do too many different competencies, then you're going to get overwhelmed. And then talk to colleagues to find out how they do this thing in their materials. If they don't do it, that's also useful because you can maybe work together to learn how to improve it. Do some action research, try some things out in your classroom. You can look for information or look for training to fill the gap. You can look at some of the books that I mentioned. You can look at the Morsic blog. How do other people do it? You can also put questions out on social media, for example, to get other people to give you ideas for how to improve. So the thing that I would like you to take away is think about how could you use this framework yourself? How could you use it in your school? Very quickly, I'm just going to mention the books that Mo had at the beginning. So if you'd like to find out more about my books, you can have a look there. I also run Cambridge Delta courses, and the link is there for you. Does anybody have any questions? I will share the links again in a moment that I shared at the beginning. Does anybody have any questions?